Pause the scroll. In the next 17 minutes, I will prove, with the same Excel sheet the IMF uses, that your dollar's half-life is 1,059 days. If that number is wrong, you can sue me in the comments. There's a pattern in history that has reset civilization 5 times in the last 2,000 years. Not reformed it, reset it. Complete erasure of debts through hyperinflation, jubilee, or war. Ancient Rome in 33 AD, medieval Europe in 1347, revolutionary France in 1789, Weimar Germany in 1923, post-war Europe in 1953. 5 times. 5 different methods, but the exact same 6-stage sequence leading to total debt annihilation. Each time the debt seemed manageable. Each time leaders promised they could be repaid. Each time mathematicians showed it was impossible. And each time the debt was erased anyway, destroying the savings of ordinary people and transferring wealth on a scale that makes today's billionaires look like amateurs. Right now, in 2025, global debt has reached 335% of GDP. That's $300 trillion in total debt against $90 trillion in annual global economic output. The United States alone owes $36 trillion. Student loans, $1.7 trillion. Auto loans, $1.6 trillion. Credit card debt, $1.2 trillion. Corporate debt, $11 trillion. It is mathematically impossible for this to be repaid. We are in stage 3 of the same 6-stage pattern that has played out 5 times before. And history says stage 4, 5, and 6 follow with the precision of a metronome. The only question is whether the reset comes through hyperinflation that destroys the currency, a government-mandated jubilee that wipes out creditors, or a war that physically destroys enough of the system that the debts become irrelevant. This isn't prophecy. This is pattern recognition. Let me show you how it happened 5 times before, why it's happening again right now, and what it means for every dollar you've saved, every debt you owe, and every asset you think you own. Before we go through the historical examples, you need to understand what a debt jubilee actually is, and why it's not optional. It's not a policy choice, it's a mathematical necessity. A debt jubilee is the complete or partial cancellation of debts across an entire economy, not because governments are generous, but because the alternative is total systemic collapse. When debt reaches a level where it mathematically cannot be repaid, something has to give. Either the debt disappears or the economy does. Here's why this happens. Debt is a claim on future production. When you borrow $100,000, you're promising to produce enough future economic value to repay that $100,000 plus interest. When a government borrows $36 trillion, it's promising that future taxpayers will produce enough to repay that amount. But there's a limit. When debt exceeds the productive capacity of an economy, when interest payments consume all growth, when new debt is required just to pay interest on old debt, the system becomes a Ponzi scheme. And like all Ponzi schemes, it eventually collapses. The math is simple. If global GDP is $90 trillion and grows at 3% annually, that's $2.7 trillion in new production each year. But global debt is $300 trillion. If the average interest rate is just 3%, that's $9 trillion in annual interest payments. The economy produces $2.7 trillion in new value. The debt demands $9 trillion in payments. This is mathematically impossible to sustain. When this point is reached, the debt must be eliminated, not restructured, not refinanced, eliminated. And history shows there are only 3 ways this happens. Method 1, hyperinflation. The government prints unlimited money. Debts are repaid in worthless currency. Creditors are wiped out. Savers are destroyed. Method 2, jubilee. The government declares debts canceled. Creditors lose everything. Debtors are free, but the financial system collapses and has to be rebuilt. Method 3, war. Massive destruction of physical capital. Millions dead, enough chaos that the debts become unenforceable and irrelevant. Every debt crisis in history has resolved through one of these 3 methods. There is no 4th option, because when the math says the debt cannot be repaid, reality enforces that math regardless of what politicians promise.
Now let me show you the 6-stage pattern that leads to this endpoint every single time. Stage 1 is credit expansion, creates prosperity illusion. Every debt crisis begins the same way, with easy credit that creates the appearance of prosperity. People borrow, spend, and the economy grows. Governments point to the growth as proof that the debt is productive. But it's not prosperity. It's borrowing from the future. Ancient Rome, 30 to 30 AD. After Augustus established the empire, Roman credit markets exploded. Wealthy patricians lent to plebeians, merchants, and even to other patricians. The Senate authorized massive public works funded by borrowing. Aqueducts, roads, forums, all built on credit. The Roman elite competed to outspend each other. Senators borrowed to fund gladiatorial games. Governors borrowed to bribe their way into positions. The economy seemed to be booming. More construction, more trade, more luxury goods flowing into Rome from across the empire. But the growth was illusory. The construction didn't generate productive capacity. The games didn't create wealth. The borrowing didn't fund innovation or infrastructure that would generate returns. It funded consumption, bread and circuses, entertainment and spectacle. By 20 AD, private debt in Rome had reached levels where most patrician families were borrowing just to maintain appearances. They owed enormous sums to creditors, but as long as new loans were available, they could keep spending. Medieval Europe, 1300 to 1340. After the agricultural boom of the High Middle Ages, credit became widely available. Italian banking houses, the Bardi, Peruzzi, and Medici, lent to kings, nobles, merchants, and even to the church. Kings borrowed to fund wars. The 100 Years' War between England and France was largely financed by Italian loans. Edward III of England borrowed over 1.5 million florins from Italian bankers. That's equivalent to billions today. The credit expansion created apparent prosperity. Trade flourished, cathedral construction accelerated, universities were founded. But beneath the surface, the debts were accumulating. Kings were borrowing to repay previous loans. The Bardi and Peruzzi banks had lent so much to European monarchs that they were exposed to sovereign default risk. Revolutionary France, 1700 to 1785. After Louis XIV's wars, France was deeply in debt. But instead of austerity, his successors borrowed more. Louis XV borrowed to fund wars in Austria, Poland, and the 7 Years' War. Louis XVI inherited debts consuming 50% of government revenue just in interest payments. But the economy seemed fine. Paris was the cultural capital of Europe. The nobility lived in opulence. Versailles hosted lavish parties. The credit kept flowing because everyone assumed France, the wealthiest nation in Europe, could always borrow more. Weimar Germany, 1918 to 1921. After World War I, Germany faced reparations payments imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. 132 billion gold marks, an impossible sum. The German government began borrowing domestically to make payments, to fund reconstruction, and to avoid the political pain of raising taxes. The economy initially recovered. Unemployment fell, production increased. The credit expansion created jobs and growth. But it was all borrowed. The money wasn't real. It was future claims on production that Germany couldn't possibly deliver. Post-World War II, Western world, 1950 to 1980. After the war, the Western world entered the greatest credit expansion in history. The U.S. created the GI Bill, subsidizing housing, education, and business loans for millions of veterans. Europe received Marshall Plan aid, much of it extended as credit. The credit fueled the post-war boom. The economy grew faster than any time in history. Living standards soared. Governments could borrow cheaply because growth was high and inflation was low. The prosperity seemed permanent, but it was stage one, the credit expansion that creates the illusion, the borrowing that feels like growth. And stage one always leads to stage two. Stage two is debt reaches 250% plus of GDP. At some point, the borrowing exceeds a critical threshold. Economists have identified this threshold as approximately 250% of GDP, total debt to economic output. Once debt passes this level, growth begins to slow because resources are diverted from productive investment to debt service. Ancient Rome, 30 to 33 AD. By the early 30s AD, under Emperor Tiberius, private debt in Rome had reached unsustainable levels. The exact ratio to GDP isn't calculable because Romans didn't measure GDP, but contemporary accounts described debt levels as universal and crushing. Senators owed millions of sesterces. Merchants couldn't repay loans. Even wealthy families were insolvent on paper. The entire Roman economy was leveraged beyond its capacity to produce. Medieval Europe, 1340 to 1345. By 1340, European sovereign debt had reached crisis levels. Edward III of England owed the Italian banks more than his kingdom's entire annual revenue. France owed similar amounts. The banking houses were exposed to defaults totaling more than 10 times their capital reserves. The credit market began to freeze. Banks stopped lending. Interest rates spiked. Kings who had borrowed easily for decades suddenly couldn't find new creditors.